the picturesque, I think you were very daring to choose this theme for the conference, because the picturesque might not be a very flattering thing to say about a film. The picturesque in itself can be quite detrimental if it's just that, you know, superficial beauty of a film. So that kind of understanding is a risk. I'm sure that's not what Agnes intended with recuperating this word and this concept. In particular, in our world today, where we know that as concerns landscape, for example, we can't simply devote ourselves to a romantic contemplation of an immutable landscape, because landscapes are being attacked, are being desecrated, are being polluted, are being destroyed by exploitation, by profit, for profit purposes, and so on. In the view of this kind of attack, I think that a number of films that contain images of extreme beauty, they bring death within that beauty. They bring that stain within it. I think, for example, of a film such as Timbuktu by Abderrahman Sissako, which shows that Sahel landscape in Africa, which is in Mali, which is of an extreme beauty. It touches the sublime. However, within that landscape, we have the attack on the landscape by terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda organizations that shoot on the landscape and cause the death of animals and human beings that are living there. That direct attack on the landscape can also be seen, for example, in a film Winter Sleep by Nuri Bilge Ceylan, where we have the Cappadocia wonderful rocky landscape with houses excavated inside the rocks. It's just incredibly beautiful. But what do we see there meandering across that landscape? Those groups of tourists that are already desecrating the landscape and announcing its end. So even a film, a series, a TV series like David Attenborough, Blue Planet, the last installment that he has shown on TV, cannot remain on the simple wonders of animals and landscapes across the world, but has to go down to the fish and other marine animals choking on plastic. So that is how the film has to end, because it's being attacked. So that beauty brings with it the idea of the ephemeral, and the death, its own end, is inscribed in the picturesque. I think that the Japanese have a very fitting concept for that, which is the concept of ukiyo. Ukiyo is translated literally as floating world. And there is the, the pictures made of the ukiyo, which is the ukiyo-e, the pictures of the floating world. And what these pictures represent is precisely that, the ephemerality of the beauty, the picturesque. Is a beauty that is going to pass, like the cherry blossoms. The cherry blossoms are beautiful, but at the same time are extremely sad, because we know, looking at them, that they are going to finish very soon. So they announce their end within their beauty. That's what the picturesque is for me. But I think that there are traditions in world cinema that give more emphasis on the pictorial origins of cinema than others. In France, Jacques Aumont, for example, calls Lumière the first painter of cinema, the impressionist painter of cinema. There is a very strong pictorial tradition in the French cinema that we cannot, I don't think, encounter elsewhere. We have even today filmmakers like Paolo Sorrentino in Italy that explores that pictorial quality of cinema to extremes of aestheticization. I like his films very much because, again, he brings the corruption of the power within the beauty of the picture. In Brazil, we don't have that tradition so strong. It's much more musical than pictorial. But I think European cinema in particular is very influenced by painting. And I was just talking about Almodovar's last picture, Pain and Glory. And we can see that it's basically painting is at the center of his conception of cinema that starts with a big color palette that produces a kind of pictorial chaos from which the film emerges. It's very interesting. So it comes directly from painting. Laura Mulvey is a genius when she talks about visual pleasure in narrative cinema. And why was her 1975 article so important? Because I think she struck such a strong chord within a certain Protestant culture that is condemns pleasures, that is against pleasure, and makes that there is always an element of guilt when you are enjoying something. I think it's something that comes with Christianity. The element of guilt has always to be there. But in particular, with the Protestant branch, this becomes even stronger. I think that Laura Mulvey, when she banished pleasure, which is the end of her very strong manifesto-like article, from the enjoyment of cinema. She was referring to a particular kind of cinema, which is American cinema, and American cinema of the Golden Age, the American cinema that the Europeans were looking at after the war. So there was that huge euphoria after the war when American cinema was finally allowed to be watched in countries such as Germany, France, Italy, and so on. And because it was a fantastic production, production with splendorous artistic and narrative skills, it's something that became a fever among all those who wanted to make films in Europe. So it created all these fanatics for American cinema in France that then were writing in the Cahiers du Cinéma and would become the originators of the French New Wave. So, but obviously, in particular for women, and Laura Mulvey was the first to notice that, it was an enjoyment that came with a huge sense of guilt. Why? Because this was a cinema that was ideologically manipulative. It was a film that objectified women. It was a film that glorified guns and violence. It was a kind of cinema that promoted prejudice, racial prejudice, starting with the Native Americans, who were the victim of that, that created smoking addiction all over the world. So smoking a cigarette was considered something extremely glamorous. It was a cinema that promoted casino gambling as an activity that is extremely glamorous again. So that generation that was left-wing, wanted to change society, blah, blah, found it hard to reconcile those purposes, those aims, with watching American films, with all that ideological baggage that it brought with it. So Laura Mulvey came with that very radical attitude, condemning pleasure, if pleasure is to be associated with that kind of American cinema, and proposing instead a kind of experimental cinema that was more cerebral, more Brechtian inspired, where pleasure would come from the understanding of the cinema and not from manipulation of your feelings. But obviously, even Laura Mulvey herself then wrote the afterthoughts on visual pleasure narrative cinema, where she readdressed the question of pleasure and confessed that she liked that American film. So she goes into more detail and some compromise on the idea. But it was something that was really touching the nerve of the problem, and that's why it was so important. But we shouldn't forget that there are opposite reactions to that. So, for example, if you look at a film by Nagisa Oshima, The Realm of the Senses, where the proposal is precisely the very opposite, is to accept your need of pleasure, of full identification with the film, to the point that you let yourself be contaminated by the sex being staged in the film. And by the way, this sex is not only staged, but carried out in reality. Is real sex. It's not sex on screen. So that means that the whole attitude of crew and cast has to change. In the case of The Realm of the Senses, both the male actor who was married had to come to an agreement with his wife that he would be betraying her for a time. There were consequences to the actress as well. There were consequences to the entire crew that had to... Oshima describes this as a ritual. They had to all to participate in that as if they were praying, is Oshima's words. And this is meant to contaminate the spectator. The spectator is not meant to be distanced from those acts. It is meant to participate, to be excited by the film. And this is the same function that Shunga had, the erotic ukiyo-e, had this function of allowing the reader, the viewer, to masturbate. That was the function of the Shunga in those days, in the 19th century. And Shunga was a great inspiration for Oshima to conceive of all the framings, the costumes, the color patterns. Everything was inspired by Shunga there. So Oshima wanted to bring back that freedom, that sexual freedom that was embedded in a certain moment of Japanese art history, and that was being oppressed by the rising military power in Japan in the 1930s. So when the story is set, the story of Sada Abe, which is a real story. So in this very same year when Laura Mulvey was writing against visual pleasure. Oshima was celebrating visual and carnal pleasures as a political attitude towards cinema. But then obviously you have to change the cinema, you have to make a different kind of cinema. A cinema that is political for embracing something that is always in the back of people's minds, and he wanted to bring it out to the fore. In the case of Brazilian cinema, it's true that the arts don't come alone by themselves. They come with a certain visual conception. They come with colors. There is one of our interviewees who is also an art director, Renata Pinheiro. She discovered those flashy colors that those poorer layers of Brazilian society like to wear and to decorate their clubs and balls and parties with, or to dye their hair in those flashy colors and so on. They are much less ashamed of expressing their emotions in colors and in flashy kind of outfits and things like that than other layers of society. And she used that to the formal conception of her film. One of them is called Love, Plastic and Noise. And just this title already gives the idea of the visual conception that she had for the film. And it's also true that Brazilian society, because of music, is perhaps more keen to sensual displays on screen. So parts of Brazil are very warm too, so you wear less clothes, so more skin is shown in Brazil. There is more physical contact between the actors than I see in other films, and I think this is a cultural element that starts with music, filters through carnival, through the review theater or teatro de revista, that is also very carnivalesque and very musical. So I think those things are not, you cannot look at art expressions isolatedly. You have to see how they converse among themselves as well. I developed this idea now in the book I'm currently writing, and I made a kind of longish comparison between this film, Delicate Crime, and Les Mystères Picasso, The Mystery of Picasso by Henri-Georges Clouzot, which both tried to do the same thing, to shoot a painting in the making, that you don't know how this painting is going to look in the end, so it's totally unpredictable. And Bazin loved that film because precisely of the realist aspect of it. It is really the way that a painter makes a film. So Picasso is painting behind the paper, and they developed a special ink that soaks through the paper, and you can see the painting on the other side. So they put the camera on the other side, the back side of the canvas, which is a paper, and Picasso is on the other side. But then the camera, after shooting a series of paintings that he does, turns to the other side and captures the artist himself, who is naked. He has the upper body undressed, so he's not wearing a shirt or anything. It's very interesting because he's alone. He's not looking at a model. But the first picture that he paints is a naked painter and a naked model, and there is just the canvas between them, but that canvas is transparent, and they seem to be engaging in a sexual act at the same time as the painting is being made. Only the model is not there at the moment when he's making this painting. It's just the genius of the artist, and the genius of the artist that coincides or responds to the auteur behind the camera. So it's very male-oriented, is that kind of power of the male genius, and there's Clouseau and Picasso conversing with one another. So although it is a realist project in the same sense that I talk about the passages through other arts to reality, and for this reason too, Bazin praises the film quite rightly. When you compare it with Bertolt Brech's approach to the same kind of setup, then the model, the female model, is there, and the two of them are actually engaged in a sensual act. So, and the model is giving her opinions about how the painting is being made. So she's also an active agent of that painting. And so the two are positioned in a equal standing. So for me, it's a more feminist approach to that kind of painting, but it's also an approach that invites you to reveal your desires. So your desire is not just to make an artwork. There is a sexual desire contaminating that runs across both the model and the painter. So to make that explicit is something that I think is quite revolutionary. And I think that Oshima did that to the very extreme. But Bertolt Brecht also did it in a very daring way. And his films go from, this film, Crime Delicado, or Delicate Crime, goes from literature into film, into painting, into theater. The theater plays that are portrayed there were theater plays that were showing during the period that the film was made. So he just went to the theaters and filmed the plays that were actually being staged. So it's an interpenetration of presentation and representation. It's a fusion of both, and that's the beauty of the film, I think.